Jaya. So that's Sri Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Namacharya Haridas Thakur ki jai. Ram Sikho Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Gaur Bhaktivinoda ki jai. Sri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopida Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan ki jai. Sri Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Navadvip Dham ki jai. Ranga Shrimana Tulsi Bhakti Devi ki jai. Ananda Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai. Samaveta Bhaktivinoda ki jai. Go Premanandi. All glory to some of the bodies, all glory to some of the bodies, all glory to some of the bodies, all glory to Shri Guru and Shri Garanga, all glory to Shri Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvashesha Shurjavani Paschachadesha Tarane Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasati Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 2, Chapter 2, Text 4. Satyam Chito Kim Kasipo Prayasai Baho Swaside Hyupa Bharanai Kim Sat Anjalo Kim Purusha Purudhana Patya Dig Avalkala Bho Sati Kim Dukulai Satyam, being in possession, Shato, earthly flats, Kim, where is it necessary? Kasipo, beds and cots, Prayasai, endeavoring for, Baho, the arms, Swasiddho, being self-sufficient, he. Certainly, Upa Barhanai, bed and bedstead. Kim, what is the use? Sati, being present. Anjalo, palms of the hands. Kim, what is the use? Puruda, varieties of. Anna, edibles. Patra, body utensils. Dik, open space. Valkala adau, skins of trees. Sati, being existent. Kim, what is the use of? Dukulai, clothes. Translation: when there are ample earthly flats to lie on, what is the necessity of cots and beds? When one can use his own arms, what is the necessity of a pillow? When one can use the palms of his hands, what is the necessity of varieties of utensils? When there is ample covering, or the skins of trees, what is the necessity of clothing? Purport. The necessities of life for the protection and comfort of the body must not be unnecessarily increased. Human energy is spoiled in a vain search after such illusory happiness. If one is able to lie down on the floor, then why should one endeavor to get a good bedstead or soft cushion to lie on? If one can rest without any pillow and make use of the soft arms endowed by nature, there's no necessity of searching after a pillow. If we can make a study of the general life of the animals, we can see that they have no intelligence for building big houses, furniture, and other household paraphernalia. And yet they maintain a healthy life by lying down on the open land. They do not know how to cook or prepare foodstuff, yet they still live healthy lives more easily than the human being. This does not mean that human civilization should revert to animal life, or that a human being should live naked in the jungles without any culture, education, and sense of morality. An intelligent human cannot live the life of an animal. Rather, man should try to utilize his intelligence in arts and science, poetry, and philosophy in such a way he can further the progressive march of human civilization. But here, the idea given by Srila Sukadeva Goswami is that the reserve energy of human life, which is far superior to that of animals, should simply be utilized for self-realization. Advancement of human civilization must be towards the goal of establishing our lost relationship with God, which is not possible in any form of life other than the human. We must realize the nullity of the material phenomenon, considering a passing phantasmagoria, and must endeavor to make a solution to the miseries of life. Self-complacence with a polished style of animal civilization geared to sense gratification is delusion, and such a civilization is not worthy of the name. In pursuit of such false activities, a human being is in the clutches of Maya or illusion. Great sages and saints in the days of yore were not living in palatial buildings furnished with good furniture and so-called amenities of life. They used to live in huts and groves and sit on the flat ground. In it they have left immense treasures of high knowledge with all perfection. Srila Rupa Goswami and Srila Sanatana Goswami were high-ranking ministers of state, but they were able to leave behind them immense writings on transcendental knowledge, while residing only for one night underneath one tree. They did not live even 2 nights under the same tree, and what to speak of well-furnished rooms with modern amenities. And still, they were able to give us most important literatures of self-realization. So-called comforts of life are not actually helpful for progressive civilization. Rather, they are detrimental to such progressive life. In the system of Sanatana Dharma, of 4 divisions of social life and 4 orders of progressive realization, there are ample opportunities and sufficient directions for a happy termination of the progressive life. And the sincere followers are advised herein to accept a voluntary life of renunciation in order to achieve the desired goal of life. If one is not accustomed to abiding by the life of renunciation and self-abnegation from the beginning, one should try to get into the habit at a later stage of life, as recommended by Srila Sukadeva Goswami, and that will help one to achieve the desired success. Translation: when there are ample earthly flats to lie on, what is the necessity of cots and beds? When one can use his own arms, what is the necessity of a pillow? When one can use the palms of his hands, what is the necessity of varieties of utensils? When there is ample covering or the skins of trees, what is the necessity of clothing? So this verse indicates that one should live very simply. And as Srila Prabhupada points out in the purport, this does not mean that everybody has to renounce everything completely if they're not qualified. But the principle is that we should not become too involved in pursuing material luxuries and material enjoyment. Otherwise, we forget what the real goal of life is. So we don't have to take these words literally for all people. But at the same time, we have to understand that the purpose of life is not material pleasure. Prabhupada gives the example here of the animals. The animals do not have comfortable beds or houses. They do not cook their food in fancy ways. They live very simply. They sleep very simply. So On the other hand, we see the human being, especially in modern civilization, has developed all sorts of conveniences, which we may think are, let's say, advantages of modern civilization, but at the same time they complicate our life. Yeah? So if we compare life in our century, 21st century, and we compare that, let's say, to 1900 or around that time, we'll see that the life then was much simpler. Houses are much simpler, food was much simpler, everything was, society was much simpler. And if we go back 100 years previously, it was even more simple. And we go back 1,000 years, very, very simple. Everyone was living almost like animals. There was no fancy restaurants everywhere. They lived in very simple houses, the general population. They ate very simple food. They cooked their own food. Most of them farmed their own food also. So they lived very simply 1,000 years ago. I would just speak of 2,000, 4,000, etc. back in history. So it's only let's say with the last 500 years or so that we've complicated our life an awful lot. And a lot of this complicated life has come about because of what we call advancement of civilization, corresponding also to an advancement in science, where we get all sorts of new discoveries like electricity and machines and all things like that. So we get highly mechanized agriculture. Everything is mechanized nowadays, and we get all sorts of luxury items with the advent of science. So, and yet these things, we come to depend on all these different things. So this, in one sense, is more comfortable for our life. We don't have to strive so hard, but at the same time, it does have its problems. Even like, let's say, one generation before. Quite different from now. I went to the prairies in Canada maybe 20 years ago or something like that. One of our relatives was a farmer there. So what is a farm nowadays? It's like thousands of acres of land. He's a potato farmer. And then they have these huge machines that go over the thing, gather up all the potatoes, and they stick them in these huge warehouses, and then they have to do all sorts of things to clean them up, and then they send them off to the whatever McDonald's or into some person who makes potato chips and whatever like this. And so it's a huge mechanism, and the farmer really doesn't touch the earth at all, really. It's all machines doing everything. But he says, well, you see, my father was here, and he was actually digging up the earth, planting the potatoes, taking the potatoes out, putting them in sacks, carrying the sacks on his shoulder, and going out to the market to sell them. So he said, I can't really imagine how they were doing all this, because it's such different within one generation, the whole system of them simply farming potatoes. So in one generation or 50 years, such a change is taking place in terms of just potatoes, for instance. But it was the farming industry in general, and every other aspect of life has changed like this over time. So once it's very good, you don't have to work so hard, break your back carrying potatoes on your shoulder, and you do much more. But then there's all sorts of other inconveniences and problems that arise because of this. And ultimately, we end up with a more comfortable life, but then with all these comforts, we get there's another problem here. We get more advancement in terms of utility of things, but we get more advancement of enjoyment of things also. So we get all sorts of gadgets for enjoyment, like television and videos and cell phones and whatever like this. And this is also advancement of science. So the two things go together, things to make our life a little more easy, and then things to give us more enjoyment or more distraction in life. Okay. So the result of that is that we got plenty of time to engage with all of our gadgets and whatever. And in this way, we really forget what the goal of life is. So that's the whole problem of getting too comfortable and advanced and whatever. So civilization has its advantages. At the same time, it can also be dangerous because we forget what the goal of life is. So that's the main point here. So these it comes in terms of questions. Sometimes a fact can be stated straight. Sometimes it's put in a different, indirect way. So here, the necessity of being very simple is conveyed by asking questions. Why do we need beds and cots when we can sleep on the floor? Why do we need all this utensils when we can eat with our hands? Why do we need all this fancy clothing when you could just use the skin of trees or just walk around without any clothes on if the weather was suitable? So these questions are asked to indicate that we endeavor too much for acquiring these things when ultimately not so necessary. We can do things in a much simpler way. And when we do things in a simpler way, then we don't get distracted so much. And our senses and our mind don't get distracted onto material enjoyment so much. So that's the main idea conveyed here. We mentioned previously that the Vaishnavas, the devotees of the Lord, followers of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, they don't advocate complete renunciation. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, he took sannyas and lived very, very simply. But he did not recommend this for the majority of people. So we see that the 95 or 98% of Lord Chaitanya's followers were not renounced. They were grihastas. They were living in their houses. They had their jobs, etc. Like Srivas Pandit and all of his other followers in Navadvip. So he indicated that wherever you are, whatever situation of life you're in, you simply practice devotional service, bhakti yoga, and chant the holy name. So there was no necessity of artificially renouncing everything. On the other hand, we do see examples of very extreme renunciation. One example is Raghunath Das Goswami, who, when he was in Puri, living with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he would not cook food, not accept food from begging or anything. The normal conduct for a sannyasi or renunciate is he can beg for food. But then higher than begging for food is just to wait for food to come. You don't beg, you don't ask for anything. And if it comes, it comes. If nobody gives anything, fine. But you don't ask for anything. That's higher principle. And of course, it's more extreme. So Raghunath Das Goswami, he ended up finally just surviving on the leftover rice that washed down the drain holes from the temple after they'd washed their pots and stuff like that. So whatever rice and grains would come out, or whatever food would come out of the drain pipes, that he would collect together, and then he would eat that. So that's how he survived. So he lived a very, very austere life. Similarly, we see the Goswamis, Rupa Goswami, Sanatana Goswami, Jiva Goswami in Vrindavan. As described here, how they lived under the trees. So they didn't build a house for themselves, really. Of course, sometimes they did have little straw huts or whatever, but generally they weren't much interested in building anything for themselves. Of course, they built huge temples for their deities, but for themselves they lived very simply, and they were not really concerned about food. But usually the local inhabitants, the farmers and the other people around there, they would actually give them some food sometimes like that. But if they happened to not get anything, they weren't really concerned about it. And it is said that they would just live off a little buttermilk every day. And that was mainly, they'd drink a little buttermilk and that was it for the whole day. And so they practiced, or they showed great austere habits in their life, but they were not practicing this as a sadhana or anything. It was just naturally the result of their absorption in Krishna. So we do have examples of devotees of Lord Chaitanya who were very, very renounced, as the Goswamis were and others following them. But the majority of the devotees were living in their houses, living in towns and villages, etc. And they had occupations, they had families, but still they were practicing devotional service. So Lord Chaitanya emphasizes that we don't unnecessarily renounce. And we have examples of people who were very wealthy, and they were still devotees of the Lord. Of course, we have great examples like the king of Puri. He was a great devotee of the Lord, but he was also a king. He used to fight battles and everything, but he was also a devotee of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So a very great devotee. And we find others as well. And of course, in Bhagavatam, we find examples of great devotees. Dhruva ruled the earth for thousands of years. Ambarish Maharaj, a very great devotee of the Lord. He ruled the whole kingdom, but at the same time he was completely detached from everything. He had no interest in it at all, but he did it just as a duty. But he was a great devotee of the Lord. So sometimes we have very advanced devotees who do not renounce literally and take sannyasa or anything. They remained in their position and they continued their devotional life. Bhakti can succeed in all these different conditions. So therefore, you can be in any ashrama, brahmachari, grihastha, vanaprastha, or sannyas. And you can succeed. You can advance from faith, shraddha, all the way up to prema in any of these ashramas or spiritual orders of life. And you can be in any occupation as a grihastha, that is any varna. You could be Sudra, Vaishya, Kshatriya, or Brahmana. And there's no real distinction among the Vaishnavas which varna you come from. So in Lord Chaitanya's pastimes, of course, we have people who were not in any varna at all. So we have Haridas Thakur, who came from Muslim background. So he's technically Mlecha. But Lord Chaitanya made him the Acharya, Namacharya, the Acharya, or the great teacher of chanting the holy name. And he gave him the greatest respect, in spite of the fact that as a sannyasi, he should not actually even touch him or anything or associate with a mlecha. But he gave him the greatest honor, gave him the greatest title. And when Haridas Thakur passed out of his body, then Lord Chaitanya was touching him. He carried his body, he buried his body. He had a whole ceremony for him afterwards. So he personally took care of Haridas Thakur. So therefore, you can be from outcast background, not even in the varnashram system, and still you can become the most elevated devotee. And of course, Lord Chaitanya had people, Kshatriyas, Brahmanas, Vaishyas, or Sudras as devotees also. And there was no distinction of who's higher based upon their occupation, profession, or varna. So, therefore, anyone in any varna, any ashram, or not in any varna or ashram, outside the whole varna-ashram system, can take part in the process of bhakti and can advance to the highest perfection. That's even stated in the Bhagavad Gita, where it says anyone in any varna can attain the perfection simply by surrendering to Krishna. So Lord Chaitanya's movement is quite liberal in this respect. Of course, and then we say bhakti in general is very liberal, and we'll find similar examples in Ramanuja Sampradaya, where the outcast or the low birth person gets great honor because he's a devotee of the Lord also. And similarly in other Vaishnava Sampradayas as well. I think Kanakadas was from Sudra Varna, whatever, low Varna, but he became a great poet in the Madhva Sampradaya. So he was very famous for his devotional songs. So the Vaishnavas in general don't give much regard for Varna or Ashrama, and the main element is how you are devoted, how much you're devoted to the Supreme Lord. Chaitanya's movement, of course, this goes to a little more, we could say a little more liberal stage than others. So we find that there's more exceptions to the rules of the Varnashram system in terms of advancement of bhakti. So therefore we see Lord Chaitanya giving the highest respect to Haridas Thakur and other great devotees who were lower in the, say, social status or whatever. So in Lord Chaitanya's movement, we are very, very liberal in that regard. So the idea is that we're concentrating on the devotional aspect, and at the same time, if we are in the material world as a grihastha or whatever, we shouldn't be too attached to those facilities. And therefore this warning is given here. Why do you have to have a fancy bed? Why do you have fancy food? Why do you have fancy dishes and utensils and forks and knives and whatever you got, and clothing, etc.? So don't get carried away with trying to get the most luxurious items for your household life. You can live in the household life as a grihastha, but do not get overly preoccupied with those things so that you start forgetting about the ultimate goal. You stop your devotional activities in favor of pursuing material goals. That's very dangerous. So, yes, you can live as a grihastha and you don't have to give up everything, but don't get too attached to these things. So you have them, but don't develop attachment. So technically that's called yukta vairagya, or renunciation, vairagya, through engagement. So we can use the material facilities that we have for devotional service. There's a little contradiction there because we could say that grihastha life is a compromise and it's a license for sense gratification. Because you get married and have children and family, and then you're getting your material enjoyment out of all that. So that's a little bit of a compromise. But we know from Bhagavad Gita that even Krishna says, yes, if the kama is under control, according to rules and regulations, fine, then it's not a problem. So if the grihastha conducts himself according to scriptural rules, then he's let's say, limiting his material enjoyment. So the grihastha ashram means it's an ashram, so therefore it's headed for spiritual life, so therefore there is some control over the senses there. The grihastha has to follow some rules. He doesn't have unrestricted license for enjoyment. There's rules there for him to follow. So that's the let's say the advantage of the grihastha ashram. There are some rules so that he can advance spiritually. So the grihastha has articles, and of course because he has the license for enjoying those things, then he can get attached. So the rule for the Vaishnava is, as much as possible, use everything for the service of the Lord. And then it loses its negative qualities. So we try to engage everything for Krishna's service. And if that is done, then we don't get the negative effects of associating with material objects. So if we do that perfectly, that is called yukta vairagya, or renunciation by engagement. Bhaktivinoda Thakur says the renunciation of the Vaishnava is not sudden renunciation, but rather natural renunciation. We call it sahaj vairagya, or a natural sense of detachment. So he says that comes through the practice of bhakti itself. The more we become attached to serving Krishna purely, the less attached we are to the material world. So consequently, we don't indulge in the material endeavors, or less and less as we advance more in our devotional service. So that's the natural way of renunciation, rather than some sudden renunciation and giving up everything, giving up all your utensils and your plates and clothing and houses and beds, etc. Rather, we, by our advancement in devotional service, we naturally become detached from everything. And then we reach a state like the Goswamis where they had no attachment to anything at all. So from our point of view, they say, look like they're doing severe austerities, but for them it's not austerity, they're just attached to Krishna, that's all. And their austerity and their renunciation is simply a byproduct of their absorption in Krishna. So therefore the path of the Vaishnava is not particularly harsh. It doesn't require immediate renunciation of things. some control is there in the sense of rules and regulations to restrict our sense gratification to some degree. Okay, any question there?
Thank you for the class. You mentioned how others shouldn't become too attached to material opulence. So how do they know, individuals of different levels, how do they know that they over-endeavor material things?
So how does one know one is over-endeavoring for material things as a grihastha? Well, ultimately, if we decrease our bhakti, our devotional service, it means we're getting too absorbed in the material endeavors, and our devotional activities start decreasing and decreasing, or we have to struggle to do them. That means obviously it's not a good situation, so it's not so favorable for us. So one of the reasons can be that we're getting too much involved in material goals and material attachments, etc. So we could say the sign of our over-attachment will be the less bhakti that we're doing, and the more we're absorbed in material engagements.
It seems like to understand what is renunciation and what is practical engagement of things in Christian service, sometimes a bit of a fine line to draw. And we see that even advanced devotees sometimes can't draw that line. The example I can think of is in the pastime of Lord Chaitanya, Pundrika Dinidi. He lived a very, very opulent lifestyle, yet he was completely absorbed in Lord Krishna. So it seems that, and especially, at least in my own experience, it's like, as I grow older, I find that the things that I used to do when I was younger, like sleeping on the floor without mattress or anything like that, that was no problem there. But for me to do it now, I can't sleep. So it's like, and then what happens is like some may identify, well, he's just a sense enjoyer because things are changing. And, it's sometimes a bit of a fine line.
In one sense, when you're young, then you can go through all these austerities. When you get older, you get a little uncomfortable like that. That's obviously there. The main idea is that we can say we don't measure so much by the externals as by how much we're engaged in Krishna service. So if we're living on comfortable beds and we're sleeping more and enjoying life more as a result of that, and we're not doing so much devotional service, then that's a negative factor. On the other hand, if by sleeping on the bed then you have a good rest and then you can do more service, fine. And if you sleep on the floor when you're old and then you can't sleep at night, then you can't do any service in the daytime, then that would obviously be not very practical for you. So it's not so much the externals, but the internals. In the case of Pundarik Vidyanidhi, yes, he was very wealthy and had all these people, luxuries around him or whatever, but he was actually completely absorbed in Supreme Lord. So if he saw the peacock fan, he would go into ecstasy and then remember Krishna, etc. So as I said, we have examples of very wealthy people like Prataparudra or whatever. He was also, I think he had many wives, he had huge palaces, whatever. He was a king, he would go into battle and fight with the enemy. So he was living a luxurious life in one sense. But on the other hand, he was a great devotee of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, a very, very great devotee of Jagannath. So therefore we can't really criticize him for that. And we find many examples of other, like Ambarish or whatever, or even Yudhishthira Maharaj. So they may have this external feature of looking like they're enjoying in the material world, but if they are absorbed in the Supreme Lord, it's not a disadvantage at all.
What is the difference between Brahma Gaudiya Sampradaya and Brahma Gaudiya Sampradaya?
Brahma?
The Gaudiya Sampradaya, the ones that...
And the Brahma Sampradaya. The Brahma Sampradaya, we could say, is the Sampradaya that originates from Brahma. And through Brahma, we come down to Veda Vyasa. From Veda Vyasa, we get to Madhvacharya. So Madhvacharya establishes that sampradaya in its present form with this particular philosophy, etc., which is called Dvaita, which is a Vaishnava philosophy that emphasizes the difference between Supreme Lord and everything else. Jivas are different from each other, different from the Lord. Matter is different from the Supreme Lord. Supreme Lord is different from all three, the other two, etc. like this. So it's based on differences, this whole philosophy. So in terms of philosophy, it's a little bit different from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's philosophy, which is Achintya Bheda Bhed, inconceivably difference and non-difference. So Madhvacharya emphasizes difference. Everything is different. And that's natural to have difference, as intrinsic to existence is difference. Whereas Lord Chaitanya says there is oneness and difference in everything by the inconceivable Shakti of the Lord. So his philosophical stance is a little different. In terms of bhakti, of course, Lord Chaitanya's bhakti is Vaidhi bhakti, Raganuga bhakti, and then prema, and particularly prema for Krishna, and then ultimately Madhurya rasa. For Madhvacharya, it is ultimately Vishnu is supreme, and therefore Dasya rasa is very prominent there, even though he worships Krishna. In Udupi they have a Krishna deity, but Dasya rasa and Vaikuntha and Vishnu is very, very prominent philosophically speaking. So therefore it's a little more Vaidhi bhakti and Vaikuntha prema.
So Ramanuja belongs to Madhava?
No, Ramanuja is another one. It's called Vishishtadvaita. That is, we can say he was the first of the great Vaishnava philosophers in a sampradaya. That is qualified Advaita, oneness with qualification. So there's a little more emphasis upon the oneness in one sense, though he doesn't say that Vishnu is Jiva or anything like that. But philosophically speaking, there is a oneness between the Supreme Lord and everything else, just as there is a oneness of an object with its quality. So we have a book. The book is an entity and it has certain qualities. It's blue or whatever like that. It's got a certain weight. It's got so many pages in it. That's its quality. But it's a book. So the quality is part of the book. We take away all the qualities. Does the book exist? Not a particular book wouldn't exist. It would be maybe some other book or so. So the quality and the object kind of inhere together as one. So for Ramanujacharya, Supreme Lord and the Jiva and matter are all one. And matter and jivas are like the qualities of an object. So that's how they're one with Supreme Lord in that sense. So they're secondary aspects, interdependent with the object itself. So they're interdependent with Supreme Lord. So that's his philosophy. Kind of like ours, but a little bit different. Shall we say Achintya Bheda Bhed? He says oneness with a qualified difference according to like qualities.
So but he's still considered Vaishnava?
Yeah. So he also believes in the Supreme Lord is there. Our relationship is one of service to Vishnu, Vaikuntha mood, basically.
So it's Sri Sampradaya?
Yeah. Coming from Lakshmi originally. Okay. Hare Krishna.